They say the first thing war erases is distance, that one morning you wake up and find the front line on your doorstep. In Antwerp, it came quietly, carried by the smell of burnt pitch and river silt. Elias van den Broek had been drawing maps since he could hold a quill. At 16, he could trace a fortress by memory, his ink steady even when cannon thundered miles away. But maps didn't feed you, so he sold shortcuts. Smugglers' paths between patrols, shallow fords where a cart could pass unseen, 5 stivers a route, 10 if it worked twice. That morning, the air over the Scheldt was raw with frost and rumour. Spanish troops had closed their ring around Breda, and merchants whispered of famine behind its walls. Elias crouched at the edge of the harbour, sketching the outline of a canal bridge, when he heard the first hoofbeats. The horse was black, big enough to carry armour, but unburdened. Its rider dismounted before the dust settled, a man in a half-open cuirass, the metal stained like smoke. The sword on his back was too heavy for a traveller, too clean for a soldier. His name, Elias would learn later, was Johannes Krantz. "Boy," the man said in a German thick as tar, "you draw roads?" Elias nodded once. "Good, then draw one that no one sees." He tossed a coin that hit the cobbles with a sound too heavy to be silver. When Elias stooped, the man's glove closed on his wrist. "Make it fast, and make it true. If I find your ink lies to me, I'll come back and collect the difference in flesh." By nightfall, Elias had done it, a narrow trail weaving between the Spanish pickets, through reed marsh and abandoned farmsteads. He tested it himself before dawn, counting the rhythm of watchfires. It worked. He sold the copy to Kranz's men, and another, later that evening, to a courier bound for Breda's defenders. He thought it would balance the scales. It didn't. 2 nights later, smoke rose from the marshes. The path had been used by the wrong side. The garrison's relief convoy was ambushed, slaughtered in the reeds his own ink had marked safe. Elias found pieces of the wagons drifting down the canal, barrels split, blood frozen in the grooves of wheel tracks. When he ran home, his workshop was empty. The paper on his table fluttered from an open door. His sister Catrian's shawl was gone. In its place, a torn scrap of vellum with one line written in charcoal. The map was perfect. He didn't cry, not then. He packed his tools, the compass his father had left him, and the folded parchment where the ink was still wet from that fatal route. He walked out into the cold, following the hoofprints toward the west road, his boots slipping in the frost. Behind him the church bells tolled, not for prayer, but for muster. War was everywhere now, spreading like ink in water. 3 days later, outside Bergen-op-Zoom, Elias found himself in the path of another army. French banners, white crosses on crimson, moving like a tide through the winter fog. A rider called him over, young, perfumed, wearing lace instead of armour. "You there? The locals say you know these roads. Is that true?" Elias hesitated. "It depends who's asking." The rider smiled thinly. "Someone who pays in coin and silence. We need a man who can draw what he sees and see what others miss. You'll come with us." That night, Elias sat by a French campfire, sketching a ruined bridge under the flicker of torchlight. The officer leaned closer. "You've a steady hand," he said. "Ever thought of using it for something larger than tavern maps?" Elias didn't answer. He drew the bridge, the river, the frozen bodies tangled beneath. He drew until his knuckles cramped, until the ink bled thin. When the officer left, Elias looked up at the sky, the same grey he'd seen over Breda, and whispered her name. Catrian. He knew then that maps were no longer just lines, they were sentences, and he was serving his. He turned the page, pressed the nib, and began a new drawing, a rote not of stone or mud, but vengeance. Though if you're still here, it means you see what Elias saw, how a single line on a map can decide who lives and who burns. Don't let stories like his vanish in the margins. Subscribe, stay with us, because what comes next is the truth behind every border ever drawn in blood. By the time Elias reached Magdeburg, there was nothing left to reach. The city lay in pieces, a heap of smoke and prayer. Its church towers snapped like candles. He walked through streets where walls leaned inward, holding the smell of burnt linen and lime. Charred beams jutted out of the ruins like ribs. Somewhere beneath them, people still whispered the word Gott, God, as if naming him would make him look their way again. Elias had followed Kranz's trail across 3 borders and 2 tongues. The mercenary company's emblem, a wolf biting its tail, was carved into doors and burned into abandoned wagons. It wasn't a mark of conquest. It was a signature. They called themselves Die Treuen, the faithful, though they sold their faith by the week. He asked questions no one wanted to answer. The ones who did were drunk, dying, or both. In a tavern cellar still standing, Elias found a child sitting under a staircase with a wooden token around her neck, a coin of pewter stamped with the wolf. She told him about a girl, fair-haired, who carried buckets for the soldiers and sang in the kitchens. She said her name was Katrian. The captain kept her safe. Safe. That word had lost its meaning somewhere between Antwerp and here. Elias traded the child his last piece of bread for the token, whispering thanks she couldn't hear. Then he walked out, holding the coin until its edge bit his palm. At the riverbank, soldiers of the Imperial Army were piling corpses onto carts. A priest muttered blessings over each load until his voice cracked. Elias watched the procession and noticed something. One of the carts carried sealed chests, not bodies. The soldiers guarded them more closely than the dead. He followed at a distance until the wagon stopped near the encampment. When night fell, he crept closer, using the shadows of tents and the smoke of cooking fires. He listened. Inside the officers' pavilion, men argued in 3 accents: German, Spanish, and Italian. They were dividing spoils, gold, cloth, and the silver ledgers of Magdeburg's guilds. Elias crawled under the canvas flap and slid a hand along the dirt floor until his fingers found one of the discarded ledgers. He opened it just enough to see the marks, payment routes, supply roads, mercenary rosters, and stamped in the corner the same wolf sigil embossed in wax red as blood. When the sentry's shadow fell across the tent wall, Elias froze. The soldier lifted the flap, coughed, and stepped back into the cold. Only when the footsteps faded did Elias breathe again. He tore out the page with the sigil and slipped it inside his coat. That night he sat on a broken milestone outside the city, the ruins still glowing behind him like a dying forge. He opened his notebook, the one where he kept his maps, and drew a copy of the sigil. Beneath it he wrote 4 words: "Follow the pay, not the flag." He stayed in Magdeburg long enough to learn what ashes could say. The women who swept the ruins told him how Kranz's men left north with the imperial quartermaster's caravan. They took everything that could move, one said, and what couldn't, they burned. Elias joined a band of traders heading the same way, claiming to be a surveyor. He mended maps for toll guards, drew river bends for merchants, and listened. Every road was a rumor, every inn a ledger of names. Once, at a ferry crossing near the Elbe, a drunken sergeant offered to show him the quartermaster's payroll in exchange for a drink. The list was long: soldiers, sutlers, armourers, and there, Beside the columns of payment was the name Krantz, Johannes, free captain, 40 men. Next to it, the sigil again. The sergeant chuckled. He gets paid twice, that one, once by the emperor, once by the devil. When the man passed out, Elias took a charcoal rubbing of the signature. Each line, each curl, was another road leading closer to his sister. By late autumn, snow began to fall. The army moved east, toward Saxony, and Elias moved with it. He learned to vanish in plain sight, to march like a soldier, to curse like one, to sleep in mud without dreaming. Sometimes he'd draw by candlelight, the broken spire of a church, a road sign twisted by musket fire, a child's shoe in the snow. Each sketch was a wound he refused to let heal. On the eve of Advent, he reached a ruined abbey where refugees huddled in silence. One old monk offered him a bowl of broth and asked where he was bound. Elias said, "Wherever the coin takes the wolves." The monk frowned. "Then you'll walk forever, son. Wolves never run out of coin." When he woke the next morning, the monk was gone. But on the bench beside him lay a folded scrap of parchment, a route toward Leipzig with a single Latin word written above it: fraterna, brotherhood, or perhaps a warning. Elias packed his tools and turned east. The snow cracked beneath his boots like brittle glass. Above him crows circled the ruins, crying into the grey air. He didn't look back. Behind him the ashes of Magdeburg whispered his promise again. And this time he listened. If you believe vengeance and justice are the same thing, stay. The next march will prove how wrong that is. Follow the story and let history's smoke show you what it hides. Subscribe so you don't miss when Elias steps onto his next road, the one paved with drums. The Swedish banners came out of the fog like ghosts in blue. Across the Saxon plains their drums beat a rhythm that could have been thunder, slow, deliberate, certain. Gustavus Adolphus had crossed the Elbe, and with him rode every man who still believed order could be built out of ruins. Elias wasn't one of them. He didn't believe in kings or creeds anymore, only in maps. He arrived at the Swedish camp under the name Lorenz de Broek, claiming to be a Flemish surveyor. The officers didn't ask for proof, they only asked for results, and results were what Elias could give. He drew the terrain around Leipzig with surgical precision, every slope, every mill pond, every stretch of marsh that could swallow a cannon wheel. The Swedes paid in silver, but he wasn't there for silver. Rumours said Krantz had switched sides again, now fighting under a German colonel hired by the emperor, soon to defect to anyone who paid in gold. Elias had learned to read between pay lists. Krantz's name appeared, disappeared, then returned with new ranks and new sponsors. He was like smoke, impossible to catch, impossible to forget. At night, Elias sat near the picket fires, sharpening his quills with a soldier's knife. Around him, the mercenaries told stories about Magdeburg, how the flames had turned the sky red for 3 days, how mothers had drowned their children to spare them worse. Every tale ended the same way. The faithful did it. And every time Elias heard that name, he pressed the pewter token in his pocket until it cut his skin. One evening, a messenger approached his tent, a tall Swede with a parchment sealed in wax. "Orders from General Bonner," he said. "You'll ride ahead of the vanguard, map the crossing at Lutzen. His Majesty moves at dawn." Lutzen. The name rippled through the camp like a chill. The Imperial army waited there under Pappenheim, entrenched behind mist and cannon smoke. Elias nodded, folded the orders, and saddled a borrowed horse. He left before the first light broke, alone, but for the weight of his own ink. By midday, he was knee-deep in fog, thick as wool, the road to Lutzen vanishing into white. The ground trembled under distant cannon fire. He rode until the air tasted of saltpeter, then dismounted and began to draw. Through the mist came voices, German, harsh, close. He ducked behind a wagon and saw them, a handful of riders with the wolf sigil on their coats, Die Treuen, Kranz's men. Elias's pulse slammed in his throat. He counted them. 6, too many. He waited until they passed, then followed their tracks at a distance. They led to a barn just off the main road, half collapsed, its roof blown open. Inside, he saw a man hunched over a table, black hair streaked with grey, armour dull with use. The captain's voice carried low and calm. "Tomorrow the Swede dies," Kranz said, "and after that we march south. France will pay better." Elias's fingers shook. There she was, Katrian, at the far end of the barn, pale under the torchlight, carrying a bucket of water. Her eyes met his for a heartbeat before a soldier barked her name. She flinched, turned away. The bucket trembled in her hands. Elias nearly ran to her, but reason pulled him back. He would get one chance. Not tonight. Not with so many. He memorized the camp's layout, every path, every guard. Then he crept away, the fog swallowing him whole. By dawn, the world had turned to smoke and thunder. Muskets cracked like breaking bones. The Swedes charged in tight lines, drums hammering beneath the roar of cannon. The fog made friend and foe the same color, grey. Elias worked behind the lines, drawing troop movements for the Swedish adjutant, but his eyes kept straying toward the ridge where the mercenaries fought. Then it happened, a riderless horse bolting through the haze, blood streaking its flanks. Word swept like wildfire. The king was down. Gustavus Adolphus lay somewhere in the smoke, dead or dying. The drums faltered, then roared again, louder, as if rage itself had taken command. Elias seized the chaos. He slipped away from the Swedish line, ran toward the barn. The structure was half burned, the door hanging loose. Inside, only ashes and broken barrels remained. No sign of Kranz, no sign of Katrian, only the pewter token nailed to a beam like a curse. He tore it free and stared at the shape stamped into it, the wolf biting its tail, now half melted from the heat. Outside, the Swedes were winning, the imperial banners falling back. The air was thick with gunpowder and screams. Elias stumbled through the corpses, searching every fallen soldier's face. When he reached the field's edge, he found a single body wearing Kranz's colors. But the face was wrong. A decoy. Kranz lived. And somewhere, so did she. That night, when the victors built their pyres, Elias sat apart, sketching by the glow of firelight. He drew not the battle, but the road ahead. South, toward the Rhine, toward France. The ink shook with every heartbeat. Around him soldiers sang hymns of glory, but he heard only drums, the road of drums, the road that never ends. He packed his tools and rose. The wind carried the smell of burnt powder and the promise of new wars. He whispered to the darkness, "I'll find you, sister, even if I have to follow the sound of drums to hell itself." If you're still here, you've crossed Lutzen too. You've smelled the smoke, felt the ground shake, and seen how one man's vow can outlive 1,000 kings. Follow Elias to the next chapter, the war behind the war, where swords are quills and truth bleeds in ink. Subscribe so you don't miss it. End of Part 3. Waiting for Continue to begin. Part 4. Wysказали. Continue R&T scriptwriter. Сказал. Part 4. Paper Wars. 250 characters. Paris smelled of ink and rain, the kind that left the city looking polished but tired. Streets slick with mud, parchment shops steaming like bakeries. Elias arrived with nothing but a coat frayed at the cuffs and a rolled map sealed in wax. It wasn't his map. It belonged to a dead courier on the Rhine road, whose pouch he had found split open beside a musket wound. Inside was a letter addressed to a name no longer breathing, Marquis de Saint-Aubin, Bureau du Cardinal. The seal bore the cross and sword of Richelieu. Elias didn't break it. Not yet. He simply walked to the address and waited in the shadow of an alley until the guards grew bored of standing still. Then he slipped through the servants' door, past the kitchens, and into the corridors of France's quietest battlefield, the Ministry of Paper. Inside, war didn't sound like drums. It whispered, quills scratching, ledgers snapping shut, messengers whispering in codes. Here, armies were moved not by horses but by ink, the true front line of Europe. Elias's stolen letter bought him an hour of attention, then a year of work. He became Monsieur Laurent, a Flemish draftsman attached to the Bureau of Maps, tasked with updating routes between the northern garrisons. He learned the new language of war, requisitions, signatures, and cipher marks. Each curve of a penstroke meant soldiers would march or starve. He watched young clerks sign papers that condemned villages they'd never seen. But Elias didn't come to serve France. He came for information. In the minister's archives, he traced the mercenary routes backward from Bavaria to Lorraine, from Lorraine to the Low Countries, until he found a familiar symbol stamped on a shipment manifest: the wolf. The same sigil burned into Kranz's coin. Only now it was stamped beside a seal bearing 3 lilies, the mark of a French subcontractor. Kranz was working for them. Elias began stealing pieces. 1 page from a ledger, 1 note from a quartermaster's list, a torn fragment of a mercenary roster. He kept them hidden under the false floor of his rented room near the Seine. Each night he added a new scrap, building a puzzle that spelled the same truth. The war fed itself. France funded the same men it claimed to fight. Kranz's faithful were ghosts in every army, hired, dismissed, then rehired under new flags. Once, during a storm, Elias followed a shipment of grain marked for relief at Arras. The wagons stopped not at the garrison but at a warehouse run by a man called Leclerc. Inside, beneath the sacks of flour, were cages. Inside the cages, people, peasants, deserters, a few children, labor, not soldiers. Among them, a young woman with cropped hair and a scar across her wrist. For an instant, Elias thought it was Katrian. It wasn't. But the girl knew her name. She worked for the captain with the Black Wolf, the girl whispered. He took her south, said France pays better for silence. Elias pressed a silver coin into her palm and left before dawn. He spent the next months mapping not roads but corruption, tracing letters between merchants, soldiers, and priests, building a second map beneath the first. A cartography of lies. But you can't serve 2 masters forever. One night, 2 of Richelieu's spies came for him, polite, well-fed men with voices like velvet. Monsieur Laurent, one said, your ink reaches places above your pay. His Eminence appreciates talent, but not curiosity. Elias smiled faintly. Then I'll be sure to kill my curiosity before it kills me. They didn't smile back. He fled that same night, crossing the Pont Neuf as bells tolled midnight. Behind him, the Seine swallowed the sound of boots. Ahead, the wind carried whispers of war, again, always. He rode north, toward the Spanish frontier, where rumors said Kranz now guarded the pay wagons of the tercios, Spain's dying pride. In a tavern near Cambrai, a merchant showed him a torn order of march. Captain Johannes Kranz, Free Company, Escort Detail, Rocroi. The ink was fresh. Elias folded the paper, heart pounding. Rocroi, a place no map yet showed. But it soon would. He'd seen this pattern too many times. Empires bled on paper first, then on soil. France wanted to close the war with spectacle. Spain wanted to die, proving it still had teeth. And between them, always, the wolves. Before leaving Paris, Elias returned once more to the bureau. He walked through the halls like a ghost, took one sheet of fine vellum, and drew by candlelight the road from the Meuse Valley to Rocroi. He marked no rivers, no mills, only the pay routes, the supply trains, the place where gold and blood would meet. At the bottom, he wrote a single line: "Every empire ends in handwriting." He left the map rolled on his desk for whoever found it, the ink still wet, the meaning still sharp. By dawn, he was gone. Outside the city walls, he turned his horse south. The first sunlight struck the parchment tubes strapped to his saddle, the only weapons he ever trusted. The road ahead shimmered with dust and danger, the wind already carrying the faint echo of what was coming. A road of drums again, but this time he would be waiting at the end of it. But if you've followed Elias this far, you know war isn't fought with muskets. It's written first, then signed in blood. Don't look away now. The next chapter, Rocroi, is where maps turn to graves. Follow, subscribe, and stay for the reckoning. Dawn bled slow over the Ardennes. Mist clung to the hollow fields like gauze over a wound, and through it came the low rumble of drums. Steady, patient, inevitable. The Spanish tercios stood in their old squares, pikes bristling, banners heavy with dew. Across the hills the French waited, their cannon half hidden by the fog. The war had come here to die, but no one had told the soldiers. Elias crouched near the rear of the French encampment, watching the horizon through a spyglass. Rocroi. A name barely known the week before, now ready to be carved into every mouth in Europe. He had been here for 2 days, hidden among the engineers, selling maps to officers who couldn't read them, and stealing orders they didn't understand. Somewhere beyond that fog, Kranz was waiting, guarding the pay wagons, his last contract before disappearing into peace or hell. At midnight, Elias slipped from the French camp, using the chaos of supply trains to pass the lines. The moon glowed dull behind smoke. He moved through the forest like a shadow with a heartbeat, guided by the faint clatter of chains and wheels. When he reached the clearing, he saw them. 4 wagons, iron-bound, guarded by mercenaries in mismatched armor. Their captain sat apart, sharpening his blade against a stone, its edge flashing like lightning. Kranz. Time hadn't softened him. His hair was streaked white at the temples, his shoulders broader, his voice, when he barked an order, still cut like steel. Near the wagons, Elias spotted movement. A woman, thinner than he remembered but unmistakable. Catrian. Her hair, once honey-coloured, was cropped short, her hands raw from rope. She moved with the quiet rhythm of someone who had learned not to be noticed. Elias's lungs burned. He wanted to run to her, but one wrong breath could end it all. Instead, he marked each guard's position, every step, every sound. He would come back, tonight, when the battle's thunder covered the world. At dawn, the sky split open. The first cannon blast tore through the mist, shattering the silence like glass. Drums answered from every direction. The French advanced, their young commander, the Prince de Condé, riding ahead with the reckless calm of someone not yet 30. Across the field, the Spanish tercios stood unmoving, old lions refusing to bow. Elias used the chaos as his ally. While the armies collided, he crawled through the smoke and the screams toward the wagons. The air tasted of metal and powder. A horse screamed as a cannonball tore through it. The ground shook underfoot. He reached the first wagon, cut the traces of one wheel, and slid beneath. Through the spokes, He saw boots, Kranz's boots, pacing, turning. The captain barked to his men, "Hold the gold, no matter who wins. If Spain falls, we sell it to France. If France falls, we vanish." Elias rolled out, knife ready. The second guard fell before he made a sound. He caught the third by the collar, slammed him into the wheel and whispered, "Where's the girl?" The man pointed toward the ravine beyond the trees. Elias went. There, half hidden under canvas, was Katrian, bound but breathing. When she saw him, her eyes widened. Disbelief, then something deeper. He cut her ropes, pressed a finger to his lips. "Can you walk?" She nodded, a shout behind them. "Kranz! Van den Broek!" His voice was colder than powder smoke. "You've got good timing. The war ends today. One of us should too." Elias turned. Kranz stood 5 paces away, pistol drawn, blade in his other hand. "You killed my men in Magdeburg," Kranz said. "You stole my maps in France, and now you think you can steal her?" "She was never yours." Kranz smiled, thin and cruel. "Everything is someone's, boy, even vengeance." The shot came first. Wild, desperate. Elias moved on instinct. The bullet grazed his shoulder. He charged, knocking Kranz backward into the mud. They grappled, boots slipping, the world around them roaring with musket fire. Kranz was stronger, heavier. He slammed Elias's head into the earth once, twice, then froze as Elias's knife found his ribs. Kranz's breath hitched. "Do it!" he hissed. "Finish it!" Elias didn't. He let go. The captain fell sideways, clutching the wound, laughing once, sharp as a cough. "You think that changes anything?" Kranz rasped. "Another will take my place. The gold moves, the wars go on." "Not this time." Elias grabbed the captain's satchel, tore it open. The payroll ledger. He threw it into the nearby fire, pages curling black. Kranz lunged weakly, then collapsed, the laughter fading into the sound of the dying. Elias turned back to Katrian. She was shaking, blood streaking her wrist where the ropes had bitten deep. "It's over," he said. She looked at the burning ledger. "No, it isn't." He helped her to her feet. Together they stumbled back toward the French lines as the sun rose on a field of corpses. The tercios had broken, Spain's pride shattered, their banners trampled into the mud. The war's old heart had stopped beating. Behind them, the wagons burned. Gold melted into the soil. That night, as victory bells rang in the French camp, Elias sat beside his sister by a dying fire. Neither spoke. The smoke coiled upward, carrying the last of their vengeance with it. If you've made it this far, you've stood in the mud of Rocroi, where empires fell and debts were paid in silence. But peace is never what it seems. The final chapter waits in Westphalia, where ink will finish what swords began. Stay, subscribe. The truth of the treaty's silence is next. Münster, 1648. The war had ended, at least on parchment. In the grand hall of the bishop's palace, beneath ceilings painted with saints who'd long stopped listening, men in wigs and velvet wrote Europe back together with careful lies. They called it the Peace of Westphalia. The ink was barely dry, but the smell of powder still lingered in the streets. Elias stood outside the palace gates, his coat stiff with road dust, his right arm bound from the wound at Rocroi. Behind him, the city hummed, merchants shouting, soldiers begging, monks tolling bells for the dead, whose names no treaty mentioned. Katrian walked beside him, her gaze steady, unflinching. She had seen too much to look away anymore. They weren't here for peace, they were here for a name. Kranz was dead, but his ghost lingered. In the ledgers, the contracts, the coin that flowed through both armies, even after their flags were lowered. The faithful were gone, yet their masters thrived, cloaked in diplomacy. Elias had tracked the paper trail north, across burned villages and emptied fortresses, until every mark led to one place, a counting house in Münster, owned by a merchant named Caspar Verhoeven, a man too rich for war, but richer because of it. At dusk, the bells rang for vespers. Elias and Catrion crossed the square. The counting house was shuttered, but a guard slept by the door. Inside, the air smelled of ink and iron. Shelves of ledgers lined the walls like tombstones. And there, in the centre, under a hanging lamp, sat Verhoeven, older than Elias expected, his face pale, his eyes small and knowing. "I've been expecting you," the merchant said. His voice was calm, like a banker tallying coins. "You've been walking through my accounts for 3 years now. You should have stopped at Rocroi." Elias stepped closer. "I followed the gold. It led here." "Gold leads everywhere," Verhoeven replied. "What you followed was debt, the only immortal currency. Do you think killing a few captains will end that?" "I'm not here to kill you," Elias said. "I'm here to end your work." Verhoeven smiled thinly. "Then you'll have to burn the world." He gestured to the shelves. "These books are the world, Mr. van den Broek. Spain, France, the Empire. They all borrowed from the same purse. Every war you fought was paid for by the man you now face." Catrion's voice broke the silence. "Then you'll pay it back, in names." She drew a pistol, small but steady in her hand. "Tell us who funded Krantz, who bought the faithful." Verhoeven hesitated, not out of fear, but calculation. "If I give you names, new wars will start. If I don't, they'll start anyway. That's the balance. That's civilization." Elias walked to the nearest ledger, pulled it down and opened it. Columns of inked numbers gleamed like veins. Beside them he saw signatures, nobles, priests, generals. The war had not ended. It had simply changed uniforms. He looked at Verhoeven. "Balance this, then?" He struck the lantern from the table. It shattered, spilling flame across the parchment. Verhoeven shouted, lunged to save his books, but Catrion kicked him back. Fire spread along the shelves, paper curling, smoke rising in choking waves. "Do you know what you've done?" Verhoeven coughed. "Yes," Elias said quietly. "I've drawn my last map." They left him there, the flames roaring behind. Outside, the night smelled of rain and burning ink. The sky above Münster glowed orange, and for the first time in years, Elias felt the cold as something alive, something that could wash instead of scar. They walked without speaking until they reached the river. On its surface floated bits of ash that looked like snow. Catrion leaned against the bridge rail, her eyes following the current. "What now?" she asked. Elias watched the water carry the ash toward the sea. "The world will write new wars. It always does, but they'll have to do it without my lines." She smiled faintly. "Then where do we go?" He took from his coat a single piece of parchment, blank, untouched. He folded it once, carefully, and slipped it into her hands. "Anywhere we can start again," he said. "Somewhere no one cares who owns the map." The bells of Münster rang again, calling diplomats to sign what was left of peace. Behind them, the counting house collapsed in a shower of sparks. No one looked up. No one cared. The treaties would still be signed. The ink would dry. Elias and Catrion walked north, toward the fading stars. When dawn came, they were gone. 2 ghosts stepping off the edge of history, leaving behind only silence and a single truth: that the greatest wars are not fought with swords or guns or ink, but with memory, and forgetting is the final act of peace. But if you've journeyed all the way here, through smoke, ink, and silence, thank you. Elias's road ends, but the stories that built our world never do. Subscribe, stay, and keep walking with us into the next forgotten corner of history, because peace, like truth, always costs more than it claims.